Alright guys, it is 8 o'clock. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll see how the stream behaves, whether YouTube will like us or not, as we go through. As I mentioned in chat, internet is being kind of potato today. But it seems to be okay. I'll keep an eye on it, and if we see it drop, we'll stutter or stop a little bit and be sure we're alright. OBS is showing a lot of drop frames, but I think we'll be okay. So, today we are coming together for our second reading of Lovecraft stories. This one is The Horror at Red Hook. This is a shorter one than the last, and I thought the last was pretty short, honestly. So we'll probably get through this one pretty quickly. Yeah, if there weren't better options than OBS, it's kind of... it is what it is, right? So let's go ahead and just jump into it. We've got a little bit of story to get ahead of us, and we will see where it takes us. Maybe I won't get stuck in any accents tonight. That one almost stuck with me last time. Alright, so we have, by H.P. Lovecraft, The Horror at Red Hook. The nightmare horde slithered away, led by the abominable naked phosphorescent thing that now strode insolently, bearing in its arms the glassy-eyed corpse of the corpulent old man. There are sacraments of evil as well as of good about us, and we live and move to my belief in an unknown world, a place where there are caves and shadows, and dwellers in twilight. It is possible that man may sometimes return on the track of evolution, and it is my belief that an awful lord is not yet dead. Arthur Machen. Chapter 1. Not many weeks ago, on a street corner in the village of Pascoag, Rhode Island, a tall, heavily built, and wholesome-looking pedestrian furnished much speculation by a singular lapse of behavior. He had, it appears, been descending the hill by the road from Shepachet. Oh, hang on. I'm getting buffering. YouTube, why you do this? Alright, hang on. Tell you what. I don't see any other issues. OBS is just kicking back that it's got no frames. Not really seeing a whole lot of buffering now though. The stream on my end looks okay. Yeah. Oh well, let's just keep going and we'll see if it behaves itself. Holler in chat if we get some particularly bad buffering or if it stops or stutters. Okay. We'll just take it back from the top. We hadn't gotten through more than a sentence. Not many weeks ago, on a street corner in the village of Pascoag, Rhode Island, a tall, heavily built, and wholesome-looking pedestrian furnished much speculation by a singular lapse of behavior. He had, it appears, been descending the hill by the road from Shepachet, and encountering the compact section, had turned to his left into the main thoroughfare, where several modest business blocks convey a touch of the urban. At this point, without visible provocation, he committed his astonishing lapse, staring queerly for a second at the tallest of the buildings before him, and then, with a series of terrified, hysterical shrieks, breaking into a frantic run, which ended in a stumble and fall at the next crossing. Picked up and dusted off by ready hands, he was found to be conscious, organically unhurt, and evidently cured of his sudden nervous attack. He muttered some shamefaced explanations involving a strain he had undergone, and with downcast glance turned back up the Shepachet road, trudging out of sight, without once looking behind him. It was a strange incident to befall so large, robust, normal-featured, and capable-looking a man, and the strangeness was not lessened by the remarks of a bystander, who had recognized him as the boarder of a well-known dairyman on the outskirts of Shepachet. He was, it developed, a New York police detective named Thomas F. Malone, now on a long leave of absence under medical treatment after some disproportionately arduous work on a gruesome local case, which accident had made dramatic. There had been a collapse of several old brick buildings during a raid in which he had shared, and something about the wholesale loss of life, both of prisoners and of his companions, had peculiarly appalled him. As a result, he had acquired an acute and anomalous terror of any buildings even remotely suggesting the ones which had fallen in, so that, in the end, mental specialists forbade him the sight of such things for an indefinite period. A police surgeon, with relatives in Shepherdshay, had put forward that quaint hamlet of wooden colonial houses as an ideal spot for the psychological convalescence. And thither the sufferer had gone, promising never to venture among the brick-lined streets of larger villages till duly advised by the Woonsocket specialist with whom he was put in touch. This walk to Pasco for magazines had been a mistake, and the patient had laid in fright bruises and humiliation for his disobedience. So much the gossips of Shepherdshay and Pasco know, and so much, also, the most learned specialists believed. But Malone had at first told the specialists much more, ceasing only when he saw that utter incredulity was his portion. Thereafter he held his peace, protesting not at all when it was generally agreed that the collapse of certain squalid brick houses in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn, and the consequent death of many brave officers, had unseated his nervous equilibrium. He had worked too hard, all said, in trying to clean up those nests of disorder and violence. Certain features were shocking enough, in all conscience, and the unexpected tragedy was the last straw. This was a simple explanation which everyone could understand, and because Malone was not a simple person, he perceived that he had better let it suffice. To hint to unimaginative people of a horror beyond all human conception, a horror of houses and blocks in cities leprous and cancerous with evil, dragged from elder worlds, would be merely to invite a padded cell instead of a restful rustication. And Malone was a man of sense, despite his mysticism. He had the Celt's far vision of weird and hidden things, with a logician's quick eye for the outwardly unconvincing, an amalgam which had led him far afield in his 42 years of his life, and set him in strange places for a Dublin University man born in a Georgian villa near Phoenix Park. And now, as he reviewed the things he had seen and felt and apprehended, Malone was content to keep unshared the secret of what could reduce a dauntless fighter to a quivering neurotic. What could make old brick slums and seas of dark, subtle faces a thing of nightmare and eldritch portent? It would not be the first time his sensations had been forced to bide uninterpreted, for was not his very act of plunging into the polyglot abyss of New York's underworld a freak beyond sensible explanation? What could he tell the prosaic of the antique witcheries and grotesque marvels discernible to sensitive eyes amidst the poison cauldron where all the varied dregs of unwholesome ages mix their venom and perpetuate their obscene terrors? He has seen the hellish green flame of secret wonder in this blatant, evasive welter of outward greed and inward blasphemy, and had smiled gently when all the New Yorkers he knew scoffed at his experiment in police work. They had been very witty and cynical, deriding his fantastic pursuit of unknowable mysteries, and assuring him that in these days New York held nothing but cheapness and vulgarity. One of them had wagered him a heavy sum that he could not, despite many pointed things to his credit in the Dublin Review, even write a truly interesting story of New York lowlife. And now, looking back, he perceived that cosmic irony had justified the prophet's words, while secretly confuting their flippant meaning. The horror, as glimpsed at last, could not make a story, for like the book cited by Poe's German authority, lässt sich nicht lesen, it does not permit itself to be read. It's the end of chapter 1. Just sort of brings the central character and how he came to be in this small town, and hints at what had happened in the Red Hook, sort of a sub-district in Brooklyn. Chapter 2. To Malone, the sense of latent mystery and exercise in existence was always present. In youth, he had felt the hidden beauty and ecstasy of things, and had been a poet. But poverty and sorrow and exile had turned his gaze in darker directions. and he had thrilled at the imputations of evil in the world around. Daily life had for him come to be a phantasmagoria of macabre shadow studies, now glittering and jeering with concealed rottenness as in Aubrey Beardsley's best manner, now hinting terrors behind the commonest shapes and objects as in the subtler and less obvious work of Gustave Doré. He would often regard it as merciful that most persons of high intelligence jeer at the innermost mysteries. For, he argued, if superior minds were ever placed in fullest contact with the secrets preserved by ancient and lowly cults, the resultant abnormalities would soon not only wreck the world, but threaten the very integrity of the universe. All this reflection was no doubt morbid, but keen logic and a deep sense of humor ably offset it. Malone was satisfied to let his notions remain as half-spied and forbidden visions to be lightly played with, and hysteria came only when duty flung him into a hell of revelation too sudden and insidious to escape. He had, for some time, been detailed to the Butler Street station in Brooklyn when the Red Hook matter came to his notice. Red Hook is a maze of hybrid squalor near the ancient waterfront opposite Governor's Island, with dirty highways climbing the hill from the wharves to that higher ground where the decayed lengths of Clinton and Court Streets lead off toward the Borough Hall. Its houses are mostly of brick, dating from the first quarter of the middle of the 20th century, and some of the obscure alleys and byways have that alluring antique flavor, which conventional reading leads us to call Dickensian. The population is a hopeless tangle and enigma, Syrian, Spanish, Italian, and Negro elements impining on one another, and fragments of Scandinavian and American belts lying not far distant. It is a babel of sound and filth, and sends out strange cries to answer the lapping of oily waves at its grimy piers and the monstrous organ litanies of the harbor whistles. Here, long ago, a brighter picture dwelt, with clear-eyed mariners on the lower streets and homes of taste and substance where the larger houses line the hill. One can trace the relics of this former happiness in the trim shapes of the buildings, the occasional graceful churches, and the evidences of original art and background in bits of detail here and there. A worn flight of steps, a battered doorway, a wormy pair of decorative columns of pilasters, or a fragment of once green space with bent and rusted iron railing. The houses are generally in solid blocks, and now and then a many-windowed cupola arises to tell of days when the households of captains and shipowners watched the sea. From this tangle of material and spiritual putrescence, the blasphemies of 100 dialects assail the sky. Hordes of prowlers reel, shouting and singing along the lanes and thoroughfares. Occasional furtive hands suddenly extinguish lights and pull down curtains, and swarthy, sin-pitted faces disappear from windows, and visitors pick their way through. Policemen despair of order or reform, and seek rather to erect barriers, protecting the outside world from the contagion. The clang of the pistol is unanswered by a kind of... It is answered by a kind of spectral silence, and such prisoners are taken are never communicative. Visible offenses are as varied as the local dialects, and run the gamut from the smuggling of rum and prohibited aliens through diverse stages of lawlessness and obscure vice to murder and mutilation in their most abhorrent guises. That these visible affairs are not more frequent is not to the neighborhood's credit. Unless the power of concealment be an art demanding credit, more people enter Red Hook than leave it, or, at least, than leave it by the landward side, and those who are not loquacious are the likeliest to leave. Malone found in this state of things a faint stench of secrets, more terrible than any of the sins denounced by citizens and bemoaned by priests and philanthropists. He was conscious, as one who united imagination with scientific knowledge, that modern people, under lawless conditions, tend uncannily to repeat the darkest, instinctive patterns of primitive half-ape savagery in their daily life and ritual observances. And he had often viewed, with an anthropologist's shudder, the chanting, cursing processions of blear-eyed and pock-marked young men which wound their way along in the dark, small hours of morning. One saw groups of these youths incessantly, sometimes in leering vigils on street corners, sometimes in doorways, playing eerily on cheap instruments, music, sometimes in stupefied dozes or indecent dialogues around cafeteria tables near Borough Hall, and sometimes in whispering converse around dingy taxicabs drawn up at the high stoops of crumbling and closely shuttered old houses. They chilled and fascinated him more than he dared confess to his associates on the force, for he seemed to see in them some monstrous thread of secret continuity, some fiendish, cryptical, and ancient pattern, utterly beyond and below the sordid mass of facts and habits and haunts listed with such conscientious technical care by the police. They must be, he felt inwardly, the heirs of some shocking and primordial tradition, the sharers of debased and broken scraps from cults and ceremonies older than mankind. Their coherence and definiteness suggested it, and it showed in the singular suspicion of order which lurked beneath their squalid disorder. He had not read in vain such treatises as Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe, and knew that up to recent years there had certainly survived among peasants and furtive folk a frightful and clandestine system of assemblies and orgies descended from dark religions antedating the Aryan world, and appearing in popular legends as black masses and witches' sabbaths. That these hellish vestiges of old Turanian Asiatic magic and fertility cults were even now wholly dead, he could not for a moment suppose, and he frequently wondered how much older and how much blacker than the very worst of the muttered tales some of them might really be. It's the end of chapter 2. So far this all strikes as a long rant on how the city is just like the root of evil. We bring these people together and they just all find the worst of themselves. It's a very cynical look. And also I see a lot of, especially at the end of that chapter, there was the bringing back the cults are existing in the background and still happening today. That just reminds me of stories growing up, that there were satanic cults and rituals going on in the backwoods of the hometown. And you're just like, oh, come on. But that was definitely a big thing in the 80s and 90s of everyone. Like, that was the fear word for the day is, watch out, don't want to get kidnapped and sacrificed to a cult. Yeah, the satanic panic in the Midwest was something else for sure. Okay, chapter 3. It was the case of Robert Suydam, which took Malone to the heart of things in Red Hook. Suydam was a lettered recluse of ancient Dutch family, possessed originally of barely independent means, and inhabiting the spacious but ill-preserved mansion which his grandfather had built in Flatbush, when that village was little more than a pleasant group of colonial cottages, surrounding the steepled and ivy-clad Reformed church with its iron-railed yard of Netherlandish gravestones. In this lonely house, set back from Martens Street, amidst a yard of venerable trees, Suydam had read and brooded for some 6 decades, except for a period a generation before, when he had sailed for the old world and remained there out of sight for 8 years. He could afford no servants, and would admit but few visitors to his absolute solitude, eschewing close friendships and receiving his rare acquaintances in one of the 3 ground-floor rooms, which he kept in order, a vast, high-ceiled library whose walls were solidly packed with tattered books of ponderous, archaic, and vaguely repellent aspect. The growth of the town and its final absorption in the Brooklyn district had meant nothing to Suydam, and he had come to mean less and less to the town. Elderly people still pointed him out on the streets, but to most of the recent population he was merely a queer, corpulent old fellow whose unkempt white hair, stubbly beard, shiny black clothes, and gold-headed cane earned him an amused glance and nothing more. Malone did not know him by sight till duty called him to the case, but had heard of him indirectly as a really profound authority on the medieval superstition, and had once idly meant to look up an out-of-print pamphlet of his on the Kabbalah and the Faustus legend, which a friend had quoted from memory. Suydam became a case when his distant and only relatives sought court pronouncements on his sanity. Their action seemed sudden to the outside world, but was really undertaken only after prolonged observation and sorrowful debate. It was based on certain odd changes in his speech and habits, wild references to impending wonders and unaccountable hauntings of disreputable Brooklyn neighborhoods. He had been growing shabbier and shabbier with the years, and now prowled about like a veritable mendicant, seen occasionally by humiliated friends in subway stations, or loitering on the benches around Borough Hall in conversation with groups of swarthy, evil-looking strangers. When he spoke, it was to babble of unlimited powers almost within his grasp, and to repeat, with knowing leers, such mystical words of names as Sephiroth or Ashmodai and Samael. The court action revealed that he was using up his income and wasting his principal in the purchase of curious tomes imported from London and Paris, and in the maintenance of squalid basement flat in the Red Hook district, where he spent nearly every night receiving odd delegations of mixed rowdies and foreigners, and apparently conducting some kind of ceremonial service behind the green blinds of secretive windows. Detectives assigned to follow him reported strange cries and chants and prancing of feet filtering out from these nocturnal rites, and shuddered at their peculiar ecstasy and abandon despite the commonness of weird orgies in that sodden section. When, however, the matter came to a hearing, Sidham managed to preserve his liberty. Before the judge, his manner grew urbane and reasonable, and he freely admitted the queerness of demeanor and extravagant cast of language into which he had fallen through excessive devotion to study and research. He was, he said, engaged in the investigation of certain details of European tradition, which required the closest contact with foreign groups and their songs and folk dances. The notion that any low secret society was preying upon him, as hinted by his relatives, was obviously absurd, and showed how sadly limited was their understanding of him and his work. Triumphant with his calm explanations, he was suffered to depart unhindered, and paid the detectives of the Sidhams, Corliers, and Van Brunts were withdrawn in resigned disgust. It was here that an alliance of federal inspectors and police, Malone with them, entered the case. The law had watched the Sidham action with interest, and had in many instances been called upon to aid the private detectives. In this work, it developed that Sidham's new associates were among the blackest and most vicious criminals of Red Hook's devious lanes, and that at least a third of them were known and repeated offenders in the matter of thievery, disorder, and the importation of illegal immigrants. Indeed, it would not have been too much to say that the old scholar's particular school coincided almost perfectly with the worst of the organized cliques which smuggled ashore certain nameless and unclassified Asian dregs wisely turned back by Ellis Island. In the teeming rookeries of Parker Place, since renamed, where Sidham had his basement flat, there had grown up a very unusual colony of unclassified, slant-eyed folks, oh, Jesus Christ, who had used the Arabic alphabet, but were eloquently repudiated by the great mass of Syrians in and around the Atlantic Avenue. They could all have been deported for lack of credentials, but legalism is slow-moving, and one does not disturb Red Hook unless publicity forces one to. These creatures attended a tumble-down stone church, used Wednesdays as a dance hall, which reared its Gothic buttresses near the vilest part of the waterfront. Clergy throughout Brooklyn denied the place all standing and authenticity, and policemen agreed with them that they listened to the noises it emitted at night. Malone used to fancy he heard terrible, cracked bass notes from the hidden organ far underground when the church stood empty and unlighted, whilst all observers dreaded the shrieking and drumming which accompanied the visible services. Sidham then met and questioned, said he thought the ritual was some remnant of Nestorian Christianity, tinctured with the shamanism of Tibet. Most of the people, he conjectured, were of Mongoloid stock, originating somewhere in or near Kurdistan, and Malone could not help recalling that Kurdistan is the land of the Yazidis, last survivors of the Persian devil worshippers. However this may have been, the stir of the Sidham investigation made it certain that these unauthorized newcomers were flooding Red Hook in increasing numbers, entering through some marine conspiracy unreached by revenue officers and harbor police, overrunning Parker Place and rapidly spreading up the hill, and welcomed with curious fraternalism by the other assorted denizens of the region. Their squat figures and characteristic squinting physiognomies, grotesquely combined with flashy American clothing, appeared more and more numerously among the loafers and nomad gangsters of the Borough Hall section, till at length it was deemed necessary to compute their number, ascertain their sources and occupations, and find, if possible, a way to round them up and deliver them to the proper immigration authorities. To this task, Malone was assigned by agreement of federal and city forces, and as he commenced his canvass of Red Hook, he felt poised upon the brink of nameless terrors, with the shabby, unkempt figure of Robert Soydam as arch-fiend and adversary. Brings us to the end of Chapter 3, where the mask comes off. Actually, this all brings to mind generally current events in the States. Sort of a general sort of fear-mongering against the unknown or the immigrants or the unwelcome. And this really strikes as, if it was written today, it'd be called out as propaganda, just to drum up more and more hate, you know what I mean? So it's disappointing that this sort of thing continues and cycles and never really goes away. But we see it was even 70 or 80 years ago that it wasn't too far removed from what we see today. This is just trying to put a veil over it to make it seem a little bit more mystic and nefarious, but this is just hated immigrants and people as it is already, right? Alright, continuing on. Chapter 4. Yeah, exactly. It's that's part of the more interesting parts of Lovecraft. Yes, the imagery and the sort of the picture he paints can be terrifying and dark and wicked, but if you try and analyze it and you see that that's just, it's someone that's controlled by their fear, and you're wondering where they're coming from and how they see the world, and how they're twisting and manipulating their own ideas and trying to pass them out to others. So yeah, it's interesting. Like we said when we started reading Lovecraft, he's not a role model. He's not something to be emulated, but it's very interesting to see how the mind works. And times change a lot less than you might hope. Alright, Chapter 4. Police methods are varied and ingenious. Malone, through unostentatious rambles, carefully casual conversations, well-timed offers of hip-pocket liquor, and judicious dialogues with frightened prisoners, learned many isolated facts about the movement whose aspect had become so menacing. Really, fear of air conditioning. Huh. I'm sure we'll get to it. I've downloaded all of his stories, so we'll see what we're able to find, but air conditioning. Huh. The newcomers were indeed Kurds, but of a dialect obscure and puzzling to exact philology. Such of them as worked lived mostly as dockhands and unlicensed peddlers, though frequently serving in Greek restaurants and tending corner newsstands. Most of them, however, had no visible means of support, and were obviously connected with underworld pursuits, of which smuggling and bootlegging were the least indescribable. They had come in steamships, apparently tramp freighters, and had been unloaded by stealth on moonless nights in rowboats, which stole under a certain wharf, and followed a hidden canal and house Malone could not locate. For the memories of his informants were exceedingly confused, while their speech was to a great extent beyond even the ablest interpreters. Nor could he gain any real data on the reasons for their systematic importation. They were reticent about the exact spot from which they had come, and were never sufficiently off guard to reveal the agencies which had sought them out and had directed their course. Indeed, they developed something like acute fright when asked the reason for their presence. Gangsters of other breeds were equally taciturn, and the most that could be gathered was that some god or great priesthood had promised them unheard-of powers and supernatural glories and rulerships in a strange land. The attendance of both newcomers and old gangsters at Soydam's closely guarded nocturnal meetings was very regular, and the police soon learned that the erstwhile recluse had leased additional flats to accommodate such guests as knew his password. At last occupying 3 entire houses and permanently harboring many of his queer companions. He spent but little time now at his Flatbush home, apparently going and coming only to obtain and return books, and his face and manner had attained an appalling pitch of wildness. Malone twice interviewed him, but was each time brusquely repulsed. He knew nothing, he said, of any mysterious plots or movements, and had no idea how the Kurds could have entered or what they wanted. His business was to study undisturbed the folklore of all the immigrants of the district, a business with which policemen had no legitimate concern. Malone mentioned his admiration for Sudham's old brochure on the Kabbalah and other myths, but the old man's softening was only momentary. He sensed an intrusion and rebuffed his visitor in no uncertain way, till Malone withdrew, disgusted, and turned to other channels of information. Cool air, huh? I need to check and see if that was in my list. What Malone would have unearthed, could he have worked continuously on the case, we shall never know. As it was, a stupid conflict between city and federal authority suspended the investigation for several months, during which the detective was busy with other assignments. But at no time did he lose interest, or fail to stand amazed at what began to happen to Robert Soydam. Just at the time when a wave of kidnappings and disappearances spread its excitement over New York, the unkempt scholar embarked upon a metamorphosis as startling as it was absurd. One day, he was seen near Borough Hall with clean-shaved face, well-trimmed hair, and tastefully immaculate attire, and on every day thereafter, some obscure improvement was noticed in him. He maintained his new fastidiousness without interruption, added to it an unwonted sparkle of eye and crispness of speech, and began little by little to shed the corpulence which had so long deformed him. Now, frequently taken for less than his age, he acquired an elasticity of step and buoyancy of demeanor to match the new tradition, and showed a curious darkening of the hair, which somehow did not suggest dye. As the months passed, he commenced to dress less and less conservatively, and finally astonished his few friends by renovating and redecorating his Flatbush mansion, which he threw open in a series of receptions, summoning all the acquaintances he could remember, and extending a special welcome to the fully forgiven relatives who had lately sought his restraint. Some attended through curiosity, others through duty, but all were suddenly charmed by the dawning grace and urbanity of the former hermit. He had, he asserted, accomplished most of his allotted work, and having just inherited some property from a half-forgotten European friend, was about to spend his remaining years in a brighter second youth with which ease, care, and diet had made possible for him. Less and less was he seen at Red Hook, and more did he move in the society to which he was born. Policemen noted a tendency of the gangsters to congregate at the old stone church and dance hall instead of the basement flat in Parker Place, though the latter and its recent annexes still overflowed with noxious life. Then 2 incidents occurred, wide enough apart, but both of intense interest in the case as Malone envisaged it. One was a quiet announcement in the Eagle of Robert Soydam's engagement to Miss Cornelia Garriston of Bayside, a young woman of excellent position and distantly related to the elderly bridegroom-elect, whilst the other was a raid on the dance hall church by city police, after a report that the face of a kidnapped child had been seen for a second at one of the basement windows. Malone had participated in this raid, and studied the place with much care when inside. Nothing was found. In fact, the building was entirely deserted when visited, but the sensitive Celt was vaguely disturbed by many things about the interior. There were crudely painted panels he did not like, panels which depicted sacred faces with peculiarly worldly and sardonic expressions, and which, occasionally, took liberties that even a layman's sense of decorum would scarcely countenance. Then, too, he did not relish the Greek inscription on the wall above the pulpit, an ancient incantation which he had once stumbled upon in Dublin college days, and which read, literally translated, "O friend and companion of night, thou who rejoicest in the baying of dogs and spilt blood, who wanderest in the midst of shades among the tombs, who longest for blood and bringest terror to mortals. Gorge, Mormo, thousand-faced moon, look favorably on our sacrifices." When he read this, he shuddered, and thought vaguely of the cracked brass organ notes he fancied he had heard beneath the church on certain nights. He shuddered again at the rust around the rim of a metal basin which stood on the altar, and paused nervously when his nostrils seemed to detect a curious and ghastly stench from somewhere in the neighborhood. That organ memory haunted him, and he explored the basement with particular assiduity before he left. The place was very hateful to him, yet, after all, were the blasphemous panels and inscriptions more than mere crudities perpetrated by the ignorant. By the time of Sodom's wedding, the kidnapping epidemic had become a popular newspaper scandal. Most of the victims were young children of the lowest classes, but the increasing number of disappearances had worked up a sentiment of the strongest fury. Journals clamored for action from the police, and once more the Butler Street station sent its men over Red Hook for clues, discoveries, and criminals. Malone was glad to be on the trail again, and took pride in a raid on one of Sodom's Parker Place houses. There, indeed, no stolen child was found, despite the tales of screams and the red sash picked up in the areaway. But the paintings and rough inscriptions on the peeling walls of most of the rooms, and the primitive chemical laboratory in the attic, all helped to convince the detective that he was on the track of something tremendous. The paintings were appalling, hideous monsters of every shape and size, and parodies on human outlines which could not be described. The writing was in red, and varied from Arabic to Greek, Roman, and Hebrew letters. Malone could not read much of it, but what he did decipher was pretentious and Kabbalistic enough. One frequently repeated motto was in a sort of Hebraized Hellenistic Greek, and suggested the most terrible demon evocations of the Alexandrian decadence. Hel, Heloin, Sothar, Amavel, Sabaoth, Agla, Tetragrammaton, Agrios, Otheos, Ikiros, Athanatos, Yehovah, Va, Adonai, Sadi, Hamofsan, Messias, Esherahea. Circles and pentagrams loomed on every hand, and told indubitably of the strange beliefs and aspirations of those who dwelt so squalidly here. In the cellar, however, the strangest thing was found: a pile of genuine gold ingots, covered carelessly with a piece of burlap, and bearing upon their shining surfaces the same weird hieroglyphics that also adorned the walls. During this raid, the police encountered only a passive resistance from the squinting Orientals that swarmed from every door. Finding nothing relevant, they had to leave all as it was, but the precinct captain wrote Sodom a note, advising him to look closely to the character of his tenants and protégés in view of the growing public clamor. Brings us to the end of chapter 4. So there's seems to be something going on, which this is all sort of a past tense retelling from the narrator's perspective, which is basically the policemen, so the detectives. But so something obviously had happened, or at least the poor man's kind of losing it. But at this point, either could be true. But the cult-ish stylings and things that are starting to come to light, and the suspect disappearances that maybe or maybe not are linked. I'm sure we'll find out a little bit more. There's not a whole lot left. We're actually already about halfway through. So let's just keep carrying on. Chapter 5. Then came the June wedding, and the great sensation. Flatbush was gay for the hour about high noon. Impenitent motors thronged the street near the old Dutch church, where an awning stretched from door to highway. No local event ever surpassed the Sodom Garretson nuptials in tone and scale. And the party, which escorted the bride and groom to the Canard Pier, was, if not exactly the smartest, at least a solid page from the social register. At 5 o'clock, adieu was waved, and the ponderous liner edged away from the long pier, slowly turned its nose seaward, discarded its tug, and headed for widening water spaces that led to old-world wonders. By night, the outer harbor was cleared, and late passengers watched the stars twinkling above an unpolluted ocean. Whether the tramp steamer or the scream was first to gain attention, no one can say. Probably they were simultaneous, but it is of no use to calculate. The scream came from the Sodom stateroom, and the sailor who broke down the door could perhaps have told frightful things if he had not forthwith gone completely mad. As it is, he shrieked more loudly than the first victims, and thereafter ran simpering about the vessel, till caught and put in irons. The ship's doctor, who entered the stateroom and turned on the lights a moment later, did not go mad, but told nobody what he saw until afterward, when he corresponded with Malone and Shepachet. It was murder, strangulation, but one need not say that the claw mark on Mrs. Soydham's throat could not have come from her husband's, or any other human hand, or that upon the white wall there flickered for an instant in hateful red a legend which, later copied from memory, seems to have been nothing less than the fearsome Chaldee letters of the word Lilith. One need not mention these things, because they vanished so quickly. As for Soydham, one could at least bar others from the room, until one knew what to think of oneself. The doctor was distinctly assured Malone the doctor has distinctly assured Malone that he did not see it. The open porthole, just before he turned on the lights, was clouded for a second with a certain phosphorescence, and for a moment there seemed to echo in the night outside the suggestion of a faint and hellish tittering, but no real outline met the eye. As proof, the doctor points to his continued sanity. Then the tramp steamer claimed all attention. A boat put off, and a horde of swart, insolent ruffians in officers' dress swarmed aboard the temporarily halted Cunarder. They wanted Soydham or his body. They had known of his trip, and for certain reasons were sure he would die. The captain's deck was almost a pandemonium, for at the instant between the doctor's report from the stateroom and the demands of the men from the tramp, not even the wisest and gravest seaman could think what to do. Suddenly, the leader of the visiting mariners, an Arab with a hatefully negroid mouth, pulled forth a diary, crumpled paper, and handed it to the captain. It was signed by Robert Soydham, and bore the following odd message: "In case of sudden or unexpected accident or death on my part, please deliver me or my body unquestionably into the hands of the bearer of this and his associates. Everything, for me, and perhaps for you, depends on absolute compliance. Explanations can come later. Do not fail me now. Robert Soydham." Captain and doctor looked at each other, and the latter whispered something to the former. Finally, they nodded rather helplessly, and led the way to the Soydham stateroom. The doctor directed the captain's glance away as he unlocked the door, and admitted the strange seaman. Nor did he breathe easily, till they filed out with their burden, after an unaccountably long period of preparation. It was wrapped in bedding from the berths, and the doctor was glad that the outlines were not very revealing. Somehow, the men got the thing over the side and away to their tramp steamer without uncovering it. The Cunarder started again, and the doctor and ship's undertaker sought out the Soydham stateroom to perform what last services they could. Once more, the physician was forced to reticence, and even to mendacity, for a hellish thing had happened. When the undertaker asked him why he had drained off all of Mrs. Soydham's blood, he neglected to affirm that he had not done so, nor did he point to the vacant bottle spaces on the rack, or to the odor in the sink, which showed the hasty disposition of the bottle's original contents. The pockets of those men, if men they were, had bulged damnably when they left the ship. 2 hours later, and the world knew by radio all that it ought to know of the horrible affair. It's the end of chapter 5. So, shortly after the wedding, poor Mrs. Soydham was ended by something, whether it be her new husband or something else, or her new husband who was also something else. It's hard to tell, at least just yet. May not know, may not find out. But seems that they drained all her blood before leaving, and leaving her to the undertaker while taking Mr. Soydham. So there's something going on. So we continue on with chapter 6. That same June evening, without having heard a word from the sea, Malone was very busy among the alleys of Red Hook. A sudden stir seemed to permeate the place, and if apprised by grapevine telegraph of something singular, the denizens clustered expectantly around the dance hall church and the houses in Parker Place. 3 children had just disappeared, blue-eyed Norwegians, from the streets toward Gowanus, and there were rumors of a mob forming among the sturdy Viking of that section. Malone had for weeks been urging his colleagues to attempt a general cleanup, and at last, moved by conditions more obvious to their common sense than the conjectures of a Dublin dreamer, they agreed upon a final stroke. The unrest and menace of this evening had been the deciding factor, and just about midnight a raiding party recruited from 3 stations descended upon Parker Place and its environs. Doors were battered in, stragglers arrested, and candle-lighted rooms forced to disgorge unbelievable throngs of mixed foreigners in figured robes, miters, and other inexplicable devices. Much was lost in the melee, for objects were thrown hastily down unexpected shafts, and betraying odors deadened by the sudden kindling of pungent incense. But spattered blood was everywhere, and Malone shuddered whenever he saw a brazier or altar, from which the smoke was still rising. He wanted to be in several places at once, and decided on Soidam's basement flat only after a messenger reported the complete emptiness of the dilapidated dance hall church. The flat, he thought, must hold some clue to a cult of which the occult scholar had so obviously become the center and leader. It was with real expectancy that he ransacked the musty rooms, noted their vaguely charnel odor, and examined the curious books, instruments, gold ingots, and glass-stoppered bottles scattered carelessly here and there. Once a lean, black-and-white cat edged between his feet and tripped him, overturning at the same time a beaker half full of red liquid. The shock was severe, and to this day Malone is not certain of what he saw, but in dreams he still pictures that cat as it scuttled away with certain monstrous alterations and peculiarities. Then came the locked cellar door, and the search for something to break it down. A heavy stool stood near, and its tough seat was more than enough for the antique panels. A crack formed and enlarged, and the whole door gave way. But from the other side, whence poured a howling tumult of ice-cold wind, with all the stenches of the bottomless pit, and whence reached a sucking force not of earth or heaven, which, coiling sentiently about the paralyzed detective, dragged him through the aperture and down unmeasured spaces filled with whispers and wails and gusts of mocking laughter. Of course it was a dream. All the specialists have told him so. And he has nothing tangible to prove the contrary. Indeed, he would rather have it thus. For then the sight of old brick slums and dark foreign faces would not eat so deeply into his soul. But at the time, it was all horribly real, and nothing can ever efface the memory of those nighted crypts, those titan arcades, those half-formed shapes of hell that strode gigantically in silence, holding half-eaten things, whose still surviving portions screamed for mercy or laughed with madness. Odors of incense and corruption joined in sickening concert, and the black air was alive with the cloudy, semi-visible bulk of shapeless elemental things with eyes. Somewhere, dark, sticky water was lapping at onyx piers, and once the shivery tinkle of raucous little bells pealed out to greet the insane titter of a naked phosphorescent thing which swam into sight, scrambled ashore, and climbed up to squat leeringly on a carved golden pedestal in the black ground. Avenues of limitless night seemed to radiate in every direction, till one might fancy that here lay the root of a contagion destined to sicken and swallow cities, and engulf nations in the fetter of hybrid pestilence. Here cosmic sin had entered, and festered by unhallowed rites had commenced the grinning march of death that was to rot us all to fungus abnormalities too hideous for the grave's holding. Satan here held his Babylonish court, and in the blood of stainless childhood the leprous limbs of phosphorescent Lilith were laved. Incubi and succubi howled praise to Hecate, and headless mooncalves bleated to the Magna Mater. Goats leaped to the sound of thin, accursed flutes, and Egyptians chased endlessly after misshapen fawns over rocks twisted like swollen toes. Moloch and Ashtaroth were not absent, for in this quintessence of all damnation the bounds of consciousness were let down, and man's fancy laid open to vistas of every realm of horror and every forbidden dimension that evil had power to mold. The world and nature were helpless against such assaults from unsealed wells of night, nor could any sign or prayer check the Walpurgisage of horror, which had come when a sage with the hateful locked and brimming coffer of transmitted demon lore. Suddenly, a ray of physical light shot through these phantasms, and Malone heard the sound of oars amidst the blasphemies of things that should be dead. A boat, with a lantern in its prow, darted into sight, made fast to an iron ring in the slimy stone pier, and vomited forth several dark men, bearing a long burden swathed in bedding. They took it to the naked phosphorescent thing on the carved gold pedestal, and the thing tittered and pawed the bedding. Then they unswathed it, and propped upright before the pedestal the gangrenous corpse of a corpulent old man, with stubby beard and unkempt white hair. The phosphorescent thing tittered again, and the men produced bottles from their pockets and anointed its feet with red, whilst they afterwards gave the bottles to the thing to drink from. All at once, from an arcaded avenue leading endlessly away, there came the demonic rattle and wheeze of a blasphemous organ, choking and rumbling out of the mockeries of hell in cracked sardonic bass. In an instant, every moving entity was electrified and forming at once into a ceremonial procession. The nightmare horde slithered away in quiet of the sound. Goat, satyr, agape, incubus, succuba, and lemur, twisted toad and shapeless elemental, dog-faced howler and silent strutter in the darkness, all led by the abominable, naked, phosphorescent thing that had squatted on the carved golden throne, and that now strode insolently, bearing in its arms the glassy-eyed corpse of the corpulent old man. The strange, dark man danced in the rear, and the whole column skipped and leaped with Dionysiac fury. Malone staggered after them a few steps, delirious and hazy, and doubtful of his place in this or any world. Then he turned, faltered, and sank down on the cold, damp stone, gasping and shivering as the demon organ croaked on, and the howling and drumming and tinkling of the mad procession grew fainter and fainter. Vaguely, he was conscious of chanted horrors and shocking croakings afar off. Now and then a wail or whine of ceremonial devotion would float to him through the black arcade, whilst eventually there rose the dreadful Greek incantation whose text he had read above the pulpit of that dance-hall church. O friend and companion of night, thou who rejoicest in the baying of dogs, here a hideous howl burst forth. And spilt blood, here nameless sounds vied with morbid shriekings. Who wanderest in the midst of shades among the tombs, here a whistling sigh occurred. Who longest for blood and bringest terror to mortals, sharp cries from myriad throats. Gorgo repeated as nonsense. Mormo repeated with ecstasy. Thousand-faced moon sighs and flute notes. Look favorably on our sacrifices. As the chant closed, a general shout went up, and hissing sounds nearly drowned the croaking of the cracked bass organ. Then a gasp from many throats, and a babble of barked and bleated words. Lilith, great Lilith, behold the bridegroom! More cries, a clamor of rioting, and the sharp clicking footfalls of a running figure. The footfalls approached, and Malone raised himself to his elbow to look. The luminosity of the crypt, lately diminished, had now slightly increased, and in that devil light there appeared the fleeing form of that which should not flee, or feel, or breathe, the glassy-eyed, gangrenous corpse of the corpulent old man, now needing no support, but animated by some infernal sorcery of the rite just closed. After it raced the naked, tittering, phosphorescent thing that belonged to the carven pedestal, and still farther, behind panted the dark men, and all the dread crew of sentient loathsomeness. The corpse was gaining on its own pursuers, and seemed bent on a definite object, straining with every rotting muscle toward the carved golden pedestal, whose necromantic importance was evidently so great. Another moment, and it had reached its goal, whilst the trailing throng labored on with more frantic speed, but they were too late, for in one final spurt of strength which ripped tendon from tendon and sent its noisome bulk floundering to the floor in a state of jellyish dissolution, the staring corpse, which had been Robert Soydam, achieved its object and its triumph. The push had been tremendous, but the force had held out, and as the pusher collapsed to a muddy blotch of corruption, the pedestal he had pushed tottered, tipped, and finally careened from its onyx base into the thick waters below, sending up a parting gleam of carven gold as it sank heavily to undreamable gulfs of lower Tartarus. In that instant, too, the whole scene of horror faded to nothingness before Malone's eyes, and he fainted amidst a thunderous crash which seemed to blot out all the evil universe. Brings us to the end of chapter 6, where it seems everything went crazy, didn't it? It's like a DM reading off a scene of hell from a campaign they wrote themselves. Just every little bit of fan fiction of evil and dark and satanic all clumped into one thing. It's a bit of a mess of a scene, that. Alright, we are nearly there, and so let's continue with chapter 7. Malone's dream, experienced in full before he knew of Soidom's death and transfer at sea, was curiously supplemented by some oddities of the case, though that is no reason why anyone should believe it. The 3 old houses in Parker Place, doubtless long rotten with decay in its most insidious form, collapsed without visible cause, while half the raiders and most of the prisoners were inside, and both of the greater number were instantly killed. Only in the basements and cellars was there much of saving of life, and Malone was lucky to have been deep below the house of Robert Soidom, for he really was there, as no one is disposed to deny. They found him unconscious at the edge of the night-black pool, with a grotesquely horrible jumble of decay and bone, identifiable through dental work as the body of Soidom. A few feet away. The case was plain, for it was hither that the smuggler's underground canal led, and the men who took Soidom from the ship had brought him home. They themselves were never found or identified, and the ship's doctor is not yet satisfied with the certitudes of the police. Soidom was evidently a leader in extensive man-smuggling operations, for the canal to his house was but one of several subterranean channels and tunnels in the neighborhood. There was a tunnel from this house to a crypt beneath the dance hall church. A crypt accessible from the church only through a narrow secret passage in the north wall, and in whose chambers some singular and terrible things were discovered. The croaking organ was there, as well as a vast arched chapel with wooden benches and a strangely figured altar. The walls were lined with small cells, in 17 of which, hideous to relate, solitary prisoners in a state of complete idiocy were found chained, including 4 mothers with infants of disturbingly strange appearance. These infants died soon after exposure to the light, a circumstance which the doctors thought rather merciful. Nobody but Malone, among those who inspected them, remembered the somber question of old Del Rio, "An sintum quam demones, incubi et succubi, et an extali, congressu pros nasiquet." Before the canals were filled up, they were thoroughly dredged, and yielded forth a sensational array of sawed and split bones of all sizes. The kidnapping epidemic very clearly had been traced home, though only 2 of the surviving prisoners could by any legal thread be connected with it. These men are now in prison, since they failed of conviction as accessories in the actual murders. The carved golden pedestal, or throne, so often mentioned by Malone, as of primary occult importance, was never brought to light, though at one place, under the Soidom house, the canal was observed to sink into a well too deep for dredging. It was choked up at the mouth and cemented over when the cellars of the new houses were made, but Malone often speculates on what lied beneath. The police, satisfied that they had shattered a dangerous gang of maniacs and alien smugglers, turned over to the federal authorities the unconvicted Kurds, who before their deportation were conclusively found to belong to the Yazidi clan of devil worshippers. The tramp ship and its crew remain an elusive mystery, though cynical detectives are once more steady to combat its smuggling and rum-running ventures. Malone thinks these detectives show a sadly limited perspective in their lack of wonder at the myriad unexplainable details and the suggested obscurity of the whole case. Though he is just as critical of the newspapers, which saw only a morbid sensation and gloated over a minor sadist cult when they might have proclaimed a horror from the universe's very heart. He is content to rest silent in Shepashin, calming his nervous system and praying that time may gradually transfer his terrible experience from the realm of present reality to that of picturesque and semi-mythical remoteness. Robert Soydham sleeps beside his bride in Greenwood Cemetery. No funeral was held over the strangely released bones, and relatives are grateful for the swift oblivion which overtook the case as a whole. The scholar's connection with the Red Hook horrors, indeed, was never emblazoned by legal proof, since his death forestalled the inquiry he would otherwise have faced. His own end is not much mentioned, and the Soydhams hope that posterity may recall him only as a gentle recluse who dabbled in harmless magic and folklore. As for Red Hook, it is always the same. Soydham came and went. A terror gathered and faded, but the evil spirit of darkness and squalor broods on amongst the mongrels in the old brick houses, and prowling bands still parade on unknown errands past windows where lights and twisted faces unaccountably appear and disappear. Age-old horror is a hydra with 1,000 heads, and the cults of darkness are rooted in blasphemies deeper than the well of Democritus. The soul of the beast is omnipresent and triumphant, and Red Hook's legions of blear-eyed, pockmarked youths still chant and curse and howl as they file from abyss to abyss, none knows whence or whither, pushed on by blind laws of biology which they may never understand. As of old, more people enter Red Hook than leave it on the landward side, and there are already rumors of new canals running underground to certain centers of traffic in liquor and less mentionable things. The dance hall church is now mostly a dance hall, and the queer faces have appeared in night at the windows. Lately, a policeman expressed the belief that the filled-up crypt has been dug out again, and for no simply explainable purpose. Who are we to combat poisons older than history and mankind? Apes danced in Asia to those horrors, and the cancer lurks secure and spreading where furtiveness hides in rows of decaying brick. Malone does not shudder without cause, for only the other day an officer overheard a swarthy, squinting hag teaching a small child some whispering patois in the shadow of an areaway. He listened and thought it very strange when he heard her repeat over and over again, "O friend and companion of the night, thou who rejoicest in the baying of dogs and spilt blood, who wanderest in the midst of shades among the tombs, who longest for blood and bringest terror to mortals, Gorgo, Mormo, thousand-faced moon, look favorably on our sacrifices." That brings us to the end of the horror at Red Hook. So this one was much shorter than the last. Well, yeah, because honestly it took about half the time. It had definitely different flow to it, where the previous was definitely more of what you think of with Lovecraft, the unknown, the unknowable, the otherwise invented, his own mythos that he'd sort of pulled from his manic fear. This one was more rooted in existing philosophies and mythologies and fears and terrors. So it has a different sort of vibe. It reminded me actually a lot of, I don't know if you've read any of it, but like old Constantine, the Hellblazer comics, where it was digging into the London Underground and finding witchcraft and cults and Satanism and murders and sacrifices. It had that sort of feeling to it, where it was very much almost knowable. Like it's just familiar enough. It's the evils that are hinted at in this story are a lot closer to what exist in the cultural consciousness. So I caught a lot of the same ideas and trains of thought there, similar references to the old Hellblazer stuff. So it was interesting in a different way than the last story was. This probably isn't the first Lovecraft I would recommend people read, just by virtue of it not feeling like a Lovecraft, if you know what I mean. It doesn't have the same mythos. But, it's alright. was different. That is certainly for sure. Of course, of course. I read everything, all of the things. But Hellblazer is one of my favorites. The old, like, Hellblazer comics and those at that era. It's like so good. So good. Sandman, yeah. Alright, let's see. We've got a little bit of time left. So, let's see if there's any that are particularly short. It might be alright to sneak in another one. See if I can find... see if there's... Okay, so there's some information here on these. No, it doesn't have word count until I open it. Lovely. Yeah, we've got a lot of similar tastes here. And that's good. Keeps us both grounded, right? Keeps conversations interesting when you're coming from a place of knowing similar things. That was too long. Let's see, what's the... oh, that's way too long, okay. So right now I'm just kind of browsing through the different books that I've got to see if there are any that are on the shorter side that we might be able to get through tonight. This one might be one to look at, but it might be a little bit too long still. I think Red Hook might have been the shortest of them. Yeah, that's quite a bit longer. Oh, it's Mountain of Madness. That one will be its own thing with a couple. Mountains of Madness is apparently one of his best, but also is going to be a multi-session read. There are a lot to pull from here, that is for certain. This one's a little bit shorter, 700 lines. Let's crack it open and see how long it'll take. Yeah, 19 pages might be... oh, Color Out of Space, yeah, that's a good one too. We might be able to get through that. Curse of Yig. How long is that? You know what? Let's try it. So let's try and fill the time and get a second read in tonight. This one is The Curse of Yig. This one is... oh, okay. It looks like it might be a... alright, so I think this one was written by Zealia Brown Reed, but was edited by... or it was co-authored by Lovecraft. So sort of a collaborative work for this one. We'll see if it's got the same sort of vibe and rhythm to it as Lovecraft's principal works, or whether it being co-authored is sort of a way for it to get a different feeling. But this definitely comes up in the same conversations as other Lovecraft works. So, let's begin The Curse of Yig. In 1925, I went into Oklahoma looking for snake lore, and I came out with a fear of snakes that will last me the rest of my life. I admit it is foolish, since there are natural explanations for everything I saw and heard, but it masters me nonetheless. If the old story had been all there was to it, I would not have been so badly shaken. My work as an American Indian ethnologist has hardened me to all kinds of extravagant legendary, and I know that simple white people can beat the Redskins at their own game when it comes to fanciful inventions, but I can't forget what I saw with my own eyes at the insane asylum in Guthrie. I called at that asylum because a few of the oldest settlers told me I would find something important there. Neither Indians nor white men would discuss the snake god legends, and I had come to trace. The oil boom newcomers, of course, knew nothing of such matters, and the red men and the old pioneers were plainly frightened when I spoke of them. Not more than 6 or 7 people mentioned the asylum, and those who did were careful to talk in whispers. But the whisperers said that Dr. McNeil could show me a very terrible relic and tell me all I wanted to know. He could explain why Yig, the half-human father of serpents, is a shunned and feared subject in central Oklahoma, and why old settlers shiver at the secret Indian orgies, which make the autumn days and nights hideous with the ceaseless beating of tom-toms in lonely places. It was with the scent of a hound on the trail that I went to Guthrie, for I had spent many years in collecting data on the evolution of serpent worship among the Indians. I had always felt, from well-defined undertones of legend and archaeology, that great Quetzalcoatl, benign snake god of the Mexicans, had an older and darker prototype, and during recent months, I had well nigh proved it in a series of researches stretching from Guatemala to the Oklahoma plains. But everything was tantalizing and incomplete, for above the border the cult of the snake was hedged about by fear and furtiveness. Now it appeared that a new and copious source of data was about to dawn, and I sought the head of the asylum with an eagerness I did not try to cloak. Dr. McNeil was a small, clean-shaven man of somewhat advanced years, and I saw at once from his speech and manner that he was a scholar of no mean attainments in many branches outside his profession. Grave and doubtful, when I first made known my errand, his face grew thoughtful, as he carefully scanned my credentials and the letter of introduction with which a kindly old ex-Indian agent had given me. "So you've been studying the Yig legend, eh?" he reflected sententiously. "I know many of our Oklahoma ethnologists have tried to connect it with Quetzalcoatl, but I don't think any of them have traced the intermediate steps so well. You've done remarkable work for a man as young as you seem to be, and you certainly deserve all the data we can give. I don't suppose old Major Moore, or any of the others, told you what it is I have here. They don't like to talk about it, and neither do I. It is very tragic and very horrible, but that is all. I refuse to consider it anything supernatural. There's a story about it that I'll tell you after you see it. A devilish sad story, but one that I won't call magic. It merely shows the potency that belief has over some people. I'll admit, there are times when I feel a shiver that's more than physical, but in daylight, I set all that down to nerves. I'm not a young fellow anymore, alas. To come to the point, the thing I have is what you might call a victim of Yig's curse. A physically living victim. We don't let the bulk of the nurses see it, although most of them know it's here. There are just 2 steady old chaps whom I let feed it and clean out its quarters. Used to be 3, but good old Stevens passed on a few years ago. I suppose I'll have to break in a new group pretty soon. The thing doesn't seem to age or change much, and we old boys can't last forever. Maybe the ethics of the near future will let us give it a merciful release, but it's hard to tell. Did you see that single-bound glass basement window over the east wing when you came up the drive? That's where it is. I'll take you there myself now. You needn't make any comment. Just look through the movable panel in the door, and thank God the light isn't any stronger. Then I'll tell you the story, or as much as I've been able to piece together. We walked downstairs, very quietly, and did not talk as we threaded the corridors of the seemingly deserted basement. Dr. McNeil unlocked a gray-painted steel door, but it was only a bulkhead leading to a further stretch of hallway. At length, he paused before a door marked B116, opened a small observation panel, which he could use only by standing on tiptoe, and pounded several times on the painted metal, as if to arouse the occupant, whatever it might be. A faint stench came from the aperture as the doctor unclosed it, and I fancied his pounding elicited a kind of low, hissing response. Finally, he mentioned me to replace him as peephole, and I did so with a causeless and increasing tremor. The barred, ground glass window close to the earth outside, admitted only a feeble and uncertain pallor, and I had to look into the malodorous den for several seconds before I could see what was crawling and wriggling about on the straw-covered floor, emitting every now and then a weak and vacuous hiss. Then the shadowed outlines began to take shape, and I perceived that the squirming entity bore some remote resemblance to a human form laid flat on its belly. I clutched at the door handle for support as I tried to keep from fainting. The moving object was almost of human size and entirely devoid of clothing. It was absolutely hairless, and its tawny-looking back seemed subtly squamous in the dim, ghoulish light. Around the shoulders it was rather speckled and brownish, and the head was curiously flat. As it looked up to hiss at me, I saw that the beady little black eyes were damnably anthropoid, but I could not bear to study them long. They fastened themselves on me with a horrible persistence, so that I closed the panel gaspingly and left the creature to wriggle about unseen in its matted straw and spectral twilight. I must have reeled a bit, for I saw that the doctor was gently holding my arm as he guided me away. I was stuttering over and over again. But for God's sake, what is it? And here's a picture that seems to have been by the author. I wonder if I can set up a scene capture here so I can share it out. One sec, let me see if I can add a new source. Come on. One of these days I'll learn how to use OBS properly, I'm sure. I'm sure. It's always fun when something is thrown out of the screen and you can't click and drag it. Okay, so it might just be empty. It's not capturing the thing. Okay. Alright. Let's just go ahead and remove this, and we're going to do this the old-fashioned way. I'm going to take a screenshot. Yeah. Sharing art the old-fashioned way. Exactly. Need a little bit of scuff, otherwise it's just not authentic. Alright, so we got that saved. Let's add a image. There we go. So this is what the author had in the story. That is pretty heinous looking, honestly. So pretty cursed image. We'll run with it. Dr. McNeil told me the story in his private office as I sprawled opposite him in an easy chair. The gold and crimson of late afternoon changed to the violet of early dusk, but still I sat awed and motionless. I resented every ring of the telephone and every whir of the buzzer, and I could have cursed the nurses and interns whose knocks now and then summoned the doctor briefly to the outer office. Night came, and I was glad my host switched on all the lights. Scientist though I was, my zeal for research was half forgotten amid such breathless ecstasies of fright as a small boy might feel when whispered witch tales go to the rounds of the chimney corner. It seems that Yig, the snake god of the Central Plains tribes, presumably the primal source of the more southerly Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, was an odd, half-anthropomorphic devil of a highly arbitrary and capricious nature. He was not wholly evil, and was usually quite well disposed towards those who gave proper respect to him and his children, the serpents. But in the autumn, he became abnormally ravenous, and had to be driven away by means of suitable rites. That was why the tom-toms in the Pawnee, Wichita, and Caddo country pounded ceaselessly week in and week out in August, September, and October, and why the medicine men made strange noises with rattles and whistles, and curiously like those of the Aztecs and Mayas. Yig's chief trait was a relentless devotion to his children, a devotion so great that the Redskins almost feared to protect themselves from the venomous rattlesnakes which thronged the region. Frightful, clandestine tales hinted of his vengeance upon mortals who flouted him or wreaked harm upon his wriggling progeny, his chosen method being to turn his victim, after suitable tortures, to a spotted snake. In the old days of the Indian Territory, the doctor went on, there was not quite so much secrecy about Yig. The plains tribes, less cautious than the desert nomads and the pueblos, talked quite freely of their legend and autumn ceremonies with the first Indian agents, and let considerable of the lore spread out through the neighboring regions of white settlement. The great fear came in the land rush days of '89, when some extraordinary incidents had been rumored, and the rumors sustained by what seemed to be hideously tangible proofs. Indians said that the new white men did not know how to get on with Yig, and afterward the settlers came to take that theory at face value. Now, no old-timer in middle Oklahoma, white or red, could be induced to breathe a word about the snake god, except in vague hints. Yet, after all, the doctor added with almost needless emphasis, the only truly authenticated horror had been a thing of pitiable tragedy rather than of bewitchment. It was all very material and cruel, even that last phase, which had caused so much dispute. Dr. McNeil paused and cleared his throat before getting down onto his special story, and I felt a tingling sensation, as when a theater curtain rises. The thing had begun when Walker Davis and his wife Audrey left Arkansas to settle in the newly opened public lands in the spring of 1889, and the end had come in the country of the Wichitas, north of the Washita River. In what is, at present, Caddo County. There is a small village called Binger there, now, and the railway goes through, but otherwise, the place is less changed than the other parts of Oklahoma. It is still a section of farms and ranches, quite productive in these days, since the great oil fields do not come very close. Walker and Audrey had come from Franklin County in the Ozarks with a canvas-topped wagon, 2 mules, an ancient and useless dog called Wolf, and all their household goods. They were typical hill folk, youngish and perhaps a little more ambitious than most, and looked forward to a life of better returns for their hard work than they had had in Arkansas. Both were lean, raw-boned specimens, the man tall, sandy, and gray-eyed, and the woman short and rather dark, with a black straightness of hair suggesting a slight Indian admixture. In general, there was very little distinction about them, and, but for one thing, their annals might not have differed from those of thousands of other pioneers who flocked into the new country at that time. That thing was Walker's almost epileptic fear of snakes, which some laid to prenatal causes, and some had come from a dark prophecy about his end, with which an old Indian squaw had tried to scare him when he was small. Whatever the cause, the effect was marked indeed. for indeed his strong general courage, the very mention of a snake would cause him to grow faint and pale, while the sight of even a tiny specimen would produce a shock, sometimes bordering on a convulsion seizure. The Davises started out early in the year, in the hope of being on their new land for the spring plowing. Travel was slow, for the roads were bad in Arkansas, while in the territory there were great stretches of rolling hills and red sandy barrens without any roads whatsoever. As the terrain grew flatter, the change from their native mountains depressed them more, perhaps, than they realized. But they found the people at the Indian agencies very affable, while most of the settled Indians seemed friendly and civil. Now and then they encountered a fellow pioneer, with whom crude pleasantries and expressions of amiable rivalry were generally exchanged. Owing to the season, there were not many snakes in evidence, so Walker did not suffer from his special temperamental weakness. In the earlier stages of the journey, too, there were no Indian snake legends to trouble him, for the transplanted tribes from the southeast do not share the wilder beliefs of their western neighbors. As fate would have it, it was a white man at Ocmulgee in the Creek country who gave the Davises the first hint of the Yig beliefs, a hint which had curiously fascinating effect on Walker, and caused him to ask questions very freely after that. Before long, Walker's fascination had developed into a bad case of fright. He took the most extraordinary precautions at each of the nightly camps, always clearing away whatever vegetation he found, and avoiding stony places whenever he could. Every clump of stunted bushes, and every cleft in the great slab-like rocks, seemed to him now to hide malevolent serpents, while every human figure, not obviously part of a settlement or immigrant train, seemed to him a potential snake god, till nearness proved the contrary. Fortunately, no troublesome encounters came at this stage to shake his nerves still further. As they approached the Kickapoo country, they found it harder and harder to avoid camping near rocks. Finally, it was no longer possible, and poor Walker was reduced to the puerile expedient of droning some of the rustic anti-snake charms he had learned in his boyhood. 2 or 3 times a snake was really glimpsed, and these sights did not help the sufferer in his efforts to preserve composure. On the 22nd evening of the journey, a savage wind made it imperative, for the sake of the mules, to camp in as sheltered a spot as possible, and Audrey persuaded her husband to take advantage of a cliff which rose uncommonly high above the dried bed of a former tributary of the Canadian River. He did not like the rocky cast of the place, but allowed himself to be overruled this once, leading the animals sullenly toward the protected slope, which the nature of the ground would not allow the wagon to approach. Audrey, examining the rocks near the wagon, meanwhile noticed a singular sniffing on the part of the feeble old dog. Seizing a rifle, she followed his lead, and presently thanked her stars that she had forestalled Walker in her discovery, for there, snugly nested in the gap between 2 boulders, was a sight it would have done him no good to see. Visible only as one convoluted expanse, but perhaps comprising as many as 3 or 4 separate units, was a mass of lazy wriggling which could not be other than a brood of newborn rattlesnakes. Anxious to save Walker from a trying shock, Audrey did not hesitate to act, but took the gun firmly by the barrel and brought the butt down again and again upon the writhing objects. Her own sense of loathing was great, but it did not amount to a real fear. Finally, she saw that her task was done, and turned to cleanse the improvised bludgeon in the red sand and dry, dead grass nearby. She must, she reflected, cover the nest up before Walker got back from tethering the mules. Old Wolf, tottering relic of mixed shepherd and coyote ancestry that he was, had vanished, and she feared he had gone to fetch his master. Footsteps at that instant proved her fear well founded. A second more, and Walker had seen everything. Audrey made a move to catch him if he should faint, but he did no more than sway. Then the look of pure fright on his bloodless face turned slowly to something like mingled awe and anger, and he began to upbraid his wife in trembling tones. "God's sake, Aud, but why'd you go do that for? Hain't you heard all the things they've been telling about this snake devil Yig? Ye'd ought to have told me, and we'd have moved on. Don't ye know there's a devil god what gets even if he hurts his children? What for do you think the Injuns all dancing, beats the drums in the fall about? This land's under a curse, I tell you. Nah, every soul we've talked to since we come in said the name. Yig rules here. And he comes out every fall for to get his victims and turn them into snakes. Wow, they won't none of them Injuns across the Canadian kill a snake for love no money. God knows what you done to yourself, gal. I'm stomping out a whole brood of Yig's children. He'll get you sooner or later, unless I can buy a charm off of some of them Injun medicine men. He'll get you, and as sure as there's a God in heaven, he'll come out of the night and turn you into a crawling spotted snake. All the rest of the journey, Walker kept up the frightened reproofs and prophecies. They crossed the Canadian near Newcastle, and soon afterward met with the first of the real Plains Indians they had seen, a party of blanketed Wichitas, whose leader talked freely under the spell of the whiskey offered him, and taught poor Walker a long-winded protective charm against Yig, in exchange for a quart bottle of the same inspiring fluid. By the end of the week, the chosen site in the Wichita country was reached, and the Davises made haste to trace their boundaries and perform the spring plowing before even beginning the construction of a cabin. Yeah, I just can't escape it. If it's not an accent, it's French or cultist. We're just gonna have to live with it, I guess. This one at least was a short enough spell that I don't think I'm gonna get stuck with that for any length of time. We'll see. The one on Tuesday was courting with disaster. If that one was gonna if that accent slipped out in casual speech while I was out and about my daily affairs, ooh, that one would have been fun. The region was flat, drearily windy, and sparse of natural vegetation, but promised great fertility under cultivation. Occasional outcroppings of granite diversified a soil of decomposed red sandstone, and here and there a great flat rock would stretch along the surface of the ground like a man-made floor. There seemed to be very few snakes, or possible dens for them, so Audrey at last persuaded Walker to build the one-room cabin over a vast, smooth slab of exposed stone. With such a flooring, and with a good-sized fireplace, the wettest weather might be defied, though it soon became evident that dampness was no salient quality of the district. Logs were hauled in the wagon from the nearest belt of woods, many miles toward the Wichita Mountains. Walker built his wide-chimneyed cabin and crude barn with the aid of some of the other settlers, though the nearest one was over a mile away. In turn, he helped his helpers at similar house raisings, so that many ties of friendship sprang up between the new neighbors. There was no town worthy the name nearer than El Reno, on the railway 30 miles or more to the northeast, and before many weeks had passed, the people of the section had become very cohesive, despite the wideness of their scattering. The Indians, a few of whom had begun to settle down on ranches, were for the most part harmless, though somewhat quarrelsome when fired by the liquid stimulation which found its way to them despite all government bans. Of all the neighbors, the Davises found Joe and Sally Compton, who likewise hailed from Arkansas, the most helpful and congenial. Sally is still alive, known now as Grandma Compton, and her son, Clyde, then an infant in arms, has become one of the leading men of the state. Sally and Audrey used to visit each other often, for their cabins were only 2 miles apart, and in the long spring and summer afternoons they exchanged many a tale of old Arkansas and many a rumor about the new country. Sally was very sympathetic about Walker's weakness regarding snakes, but perhaps did more to aggravate than cure the parallel nervousness which Audrey was acquiring through his incessant praying and prophesying about the curse of Yig. She was uncommonly full of gruesome snake stories, and produced a direfully long and strong impression with her acknowledged masterpiece, the tale of a man in Scott County who had been bitten by a whole horde of rattlers at once, and had swelled so monstrously from poison that his body had finally burst with a pop. Needless to say, Audrey did not repeat this anecdote to her husband, and she implored the Comptons to beware of starting it on the rounds of the countryside. It is to Joe's and Sally's credit that they heeded this plea with the utmost fidelity. Walker did his corn planting early, and in midsummer improved his time by harvesting a fair crop of the native grass of the region. With the help of Joe Compton, he dug a well, which gave a moderate supply of very good water, though he planned to sink an artesian later on. He did not run into many serious snake scares, and made his land as inhospitable as possible for wriggling visitors. Every now and then, he rode over to the cluster of thatched conical huts which formed the main village of the Wichitas, and talked long with the old men and shamans about the snake god and how to nullify his wrath. Charms were always ready in exchange for whiskey, but much of the information he got was far from reassuring. Yig was a great god. He was bad medicine. He did not forget things. In the autumn, his children were hungry and wild, and Yig was hungry and wild too. All the tribes made medicine against Yig when the corn harvest came. They gave him some corn and danced in proper regalia to the sound of whistle, rattle, and drum. They kept the drums pounding to drive Yig away, and called down the aid of Tirawa, whose children men are, even as the snakes are Yig's children. It was bad that the squaw of Davis killed the children of Yig. Let Davis say the charms many times when the corn harvest comes. Yig is Yig. Yig is a great god. By the time corn harvest did come, Walker had succeeded in getting his wife into a deplorably jumpy state. His prayers and borrowed incantations came to be a nuisance, and when the autumn rites of the Indians began, there was always a distant, wind-borne pounding of tom-toms to lend an added background of the sinister. It was maddening to have the muffled clatter always stealing over the wide red plains. Why would it never stop? Day and night, week on week, it was always going in exhaustless relays, as persistently as the red dusty winds that carried it. Audrey loathed it more than her husband did, for he saw in it a compensating element of protection. It was with this sense of a mighty, intangible bulwark against the evil that he got in his corn crop and prepared cabin and stable for the coming winter. The autumn was abnormally warm, and except for the primitive cookery, the Davises found scant use for the stone fireplace Walker had built with such care. Something in the unnaturalness of the hot dust clouds preyed on the nerves of all the settlers, but most of all on Audrey's and Walker's. The notions of a hovering snake curse and the weird, endless rhythm of the distant Indian drums formed a bad combination, which any added element of the bizarre went far to render utterly unendurable. Notwithstanding this strain, several festive gatherings were held at one or another of the cabins after the crops were reaped, keeping naively alive in modernity those curious rites of the harvest home, which are as old as human agriculture itself. Lafayette Smith, who came from southern Missouri and had a cabin about 3 miles east of Walker's, was a very passable fiddler, and his tunes did much to make the celebrants forget the monotonous beating of the distant tom-toms. Then Halloween drew near, and the settlers planned another frolic, this time, had they but known it, of a lineage older than even agriculture, the dread witch sabbath of the primal pre-Aryans, kept alive through ages in the midnight blackness of secret woods, and still hinting at vague terrors under its latter-day mask of comedy and lightness. Halloween was to fall on a Thursday, and the neighbors agreed to gather for their first revel at the Davis cabin. Okay, there's the Lovecraft bit there. Oh, lordy. It was on that 31st of October that the warm spell broke. The morning was gray and leaden, and by noon, the incessant winds had changed from searingness to rawness. People shivered all the more because they were not prepared for the chill, and Walker's old dog Wolf dragged himself wearily indoors to a place beside the hearth. But the distant drums still thumped on, nor were the white citizenry less inclined to pursue their chosen rites. As early as 4 in the afternoon, the wagons began to arrive at Walker's cabin, and in the evening, after a memorable barbecue, Lafayette Smith's fiddle inspired a very fair-sized company to greet feats of saltatory grotesqueness in the one good-sized but crowded room. The younger folk indulged in the amiable inanities proper to the season, and now and then old Wolf would howl with doleful and spine-tickling ominousness at some especially spectral strain from Lafayette's squeaky violin, a device he had never heard before. Mostly, though, this battered veteran slept through the merriment, for he was past the age of active interests and lived largely in his dreams. Tom and Jenny Rigby had brought their collie, Zeke, along, but the canines did not fraternize. Zeke seemed strangely uneasy over something and nosed about curiously all the evening. Audrey and Walker made a fine couple on the floor, and Grandma Compton still likes to recall her impression of their dancing that night. Their worries seemed forgotten for the nose, and Walker had shaved and trimmed into a surprising degree of spruceness. By 10 o'clock, all hands were healthily tired, and the guests began to depart family by family, with many handshakings and bluff assurances of what a fine time everybody had had. Tom and Jenny thought Zeke's eerie howls as he followed them to their wagon were marks of regret at having to go home, though Audrey said it must be faraway tom-toms which annoyed him, and the distant thumping was surely ghastly enough that after the merriment within. The night was bitterly cold, and for the first time Walker put a great log in the fireplace and banked it with ashes to keep it smoldering till morning. Old Wolf dragged himself within the ruddy glow and lapsed into his customary coma. Audrey and Walker, too tired to think of charms or curses, tumbled into the rough pine bed and were asleep before the cheap alarm clock on the mantel had ticked out 3 minutes, and from far away the rhythmic pounding of those hellish tom-toms still pulsed on the chill night wind. Dr. McNeil paused here and removed his glasses, as if a blurring of the objective world might make the reminiscent vision clearer. "You'll soon appreciate," he said, "that I had a great deal of difficulty in piecing out all that happened after the guests left. There were times, though, at first, when I was able to make a try at it." After a moment of silence, he went on with the tale. Audrey had terrible dreams of Yig, who appeared to her in the guise of Satan, as depicted in cheap engravings she had seen. It was indeed from an absolute ecstasy of nightmare that she started suddenly awake to find Walker already conscious and sitting up in bed. He seemed to be listening intently to something, and silenced her with a whisper when she began to ask what had roused him. "Hark, Aud," he breathed. "Don't you hear something a singing, and buzzing and rustling? Do you reckon it's the fall crickets?" Certainly, there was distinctly audible within the cabin such a sound as he had described. Audrey tried to analyze it, and was impressed with some element at once horrible and familiar, which hovered just outside the rim of her memory. And beyond it all, waking a hideous thought, the monotonous beating of the distant tom-toms came incessantly across the black plains on which a cloudy half-moon had set. "Walker, suppose it's the curse of Yig?" She could feel him tremble. "Nah, gal, I don't reckon he comes that way. He's shaping like a man, except you look at him close. That's what Chief Gray Eagle says. This here's some varmints coming out of the cold. Not crickets, I calculate, but something like 'em. I'd ought to get up and stop 'em out before they make much headway, or get at the cupboard." He rose, felt for the lantern that hung within easy reach, and rattled the tin matchbox nailed to the wall beside it. Audrey sat up in bed and watched the flare of the match grow into the steady glow of the lantern. Then, as their eyes began to take in the whole of the room, the crude rafters shook with the frenzy of their simultaneous shriek, for the flat, rocky floor revealed in the newborn illumination was one seething, brown-speckled mass of wriggling rattlesnakes, slithering toward the fire, and even now turning their loathsome heads to menace the fright-blasted lantern-bearer. It was only for an instant that Audrey saw the things. The reptiles were of every size, of uncountable numbers, and apparently of several varieties, and even as she looked, 2 or 3 of them reared their heads as if to strike at Walker. She did not faint. It was Walker's crash to the floor that extinguished the lantern and plunged her into blackness. She had not screamed a second time. Fright had paralyzed him, and he fell as if shot by a silent arrow from no mortal's bow. To Audrey, the entire world seemed to whirl about fantastically, mingling with the nightmare from which she had started. Voluntary motion of any sort was impossible, for will and the sense of reality had left her. She fell back inertly on her pillow, hoping that she would wake soon. No actual sense of what had happened penetrated her mind for some time. Then, little by little, the suspicion that she was really awake began to dawn on her, and she was convulsed with a mounting blend of panic and grief which made her long to shriek out despite the inhibiting spell which kept her mute. Walker was gone, and she had not been able to help him. He had died of snakes, just as the old witch woman had predicted, when he was a little boy. Poor Wolf had not been able to help either. Probably he had not even awakened from his senile stupor, and now the crawling things must be coming for her, writhing closer and closer every moment in the dark, perhaps even now twining slipperily about the bedpost and oozing up over the coarse woolen blankets. Unconsciously, she crept under the clothes and trembled. It must be the curse of Yig. He had sent his monstrous children on All Hallows Night, and they had taken Walker first. Why was that? Wasn't he innocent enough? Why not come straight for her? Hadn't she killed those little rattlers alone? Then she thought of the curse's form as told by the Indians. She wouldn't be killed, just turned to a spotted snake. Ugh! So she would be like those things she had glimpsed on the floor, those things which Yig had sent to get her and enroll her among their number. She tried to mumble a charm that Walker had taught her, but found she could not utter a single sound. The noisy ticking of the alarm clock sounded above the maddening beat of the distant tom-toms. The snakes were taking a long time. Did they mean to delay on purpose, to play on her nerves? Every now and then she thought she felt a stealthy, insidious pressure on the bedclothes, but each time it turned out to be only the automatic twitchings of her overwrought nerves. The clock ticked on in the dark, and a change came slowly over her thoughts. Those snakes couldn't have taken so long. They couldn't be Yig's messengers after all. Just natural rattlers that were nested below the rock and had been drawn there by the fire. They weren't coming for her. Perhaps they had sated themselves on poor Walker. Where were they now? Gone? Coiled by the fire? Still crawling over the prone corpse of their victim? The clock ticked, and the distant drums throbbed on. As the thoughts of her husband's body lying there in the pitch blackness, a thrill of purely physical horror passed over Audrey. That story of Sally Compton's about the man back in Scott County. He too had been bitten by a whole bunch of rattlesnakes, and what had happened to him? The poison had rotted the flesh and swelled the whole corpse, and in the end the bloated thing had burst horribly with a detestable popping noise. Was that what was happening to Walker down there on the rock floor? Instinctively, she felt that she had begun to listen for something too terrible even to name to herself. The clock ticked on, keeping a kind of mocking, sardonic time with the far-off drumming that the night wind brought. She wished it were a striking clock, so that she knew how long this eldritch vigil must last. She cursed the toughness of fiber that kept her from fainting, and wondered what sort of relief the dawn could bring. After all, probably neighbors would pass. No doubt somebody would call. Would they find her still sane? Was she still sane now? Morbidly listening, Audrey all at once became aware of something which she had to verify with every effort of her will before she could believe it, and which, once verified, she did not know whether to welcome or dread. The distant beating of the Indian tom-toms had ceased. They had always maddened her, but had not Walker regarded them as a bulwark against the nameless evil from outside the universe? What were some of the things he had repeated to her in whispers after talking to Grey Eagle and the Wichita medicine men? She did not relish this new and sudden silence after all. There was something sinister about it. The loud ticking clock seemed abnormal in its new loneliness. Capable at last of conscious motion, she shook the covers from her face and looked into the darkness toward the window. It must have cleared after the moon set, for she saw the square aperture distinctly against the background of stars. Then, without warning, came that shocking, unutterable sound. Ugh! That dull, putrid pop of cleft skin and escaping poison in the dark. God! Sally's story. That obscene stench and this gnawing, clawing silence. It was too much. The bonds of muteness snapped, and the black night waxed reverberant with Audrey's screams of stark, unbridled frenzy. Consciousness did not pass away under the shock. How merciful, if only it had! Amidst the echoes of her shrieking, Audrey still saw the star-sprinkled square of window ahead, and heard the doom-boding ticking of that frightful clock. Did she hear another sound? Was that square window still a perfect square? She was in no condition to weigh the evidence of her senses or distinguish between fact and hallucination. No, that window was not a perfect square. Something had encroached on the lower edge. Not with the ticking of the clock, the only sound in the room. There was, beyond dispute, a heavy breathing, neither her own nor poor Wolf's. Wolf slept very silently, and his wakeful wheezing was unmistakable. When Audrey saw against the stars the black, demoniac silhouette of something anthropoid, the undulant bulk of a gigantic head and shoulders, fumbling slowly toward her. Go away, snake devil! Go away, ye! I don't want to kill him! I was feared he'd be scared of him. Don't, ye, don't! I don't go for to hurt your children. Don't come nigh me. Don't change me into no spotted snake. But the half-formless head and shoulders only lurched onward toward the bed, very silently. Everything snapped at once inside Audrey's head, and in a second she had turned from a cowering child into a raging madwoman. She knew where the axe was, hung against the wall on those pegs near the lantern. It was within easy reach, and she could find it in the dark. Before she was conscious of anything further, it was in her hands, and she was creeping toward the foot of the bed, toward the monstrous head and shoulders that every moment groped their way nearer. Had there been any light, the look on her face would not have been pleasant to see. "Take that, you, and that, and that, and that!" She was laughing shrilly now, and her cackles mounted higher as she saw that the starlight beyond the window was yielding to the dim, prophetic pallor of coming dawn. Dr. McNeil wiped the perspiration from his forehead and put on his glasses again. I waited for him to resume, and as he kept silent, I spoke softly. She lived? She was found? Was it ever explained? The doctor cleared his throat. Yes, she lived, in a way, and it was explained. I told you there was no bewitchment, only cruel, pitiful, material horror. It was Sally Compton who had made the discovery. She had ridden over to the Davis cabin the next afternoon to talk over the party with Audrey, and had seen no smoke from the chimney. That was queer. It had turned very warm again, yet Audrey was usually cooking something at that hour. The mules were making hungry-sounding noises in the barn, and there was no sign of Old Wolf sunning himself in the accustomed spot by the door. Altogether, Sally did not like the look of the place. So very timid and hesitant as she dismounted and knocked. She got no answer, but waited some time before trying the crude door of split logs. The lock, it appeared, was unfastened, and she slowly pushed her way in. Then, perceiving what was there, she reeled back, gasped, and clung to the jamb to preserve her balance. A terrible odor had welled out as she opened the door, but that was not what had stunned her. It was that what she had seen. For within that shadowy cabin, monstrous things had happened, and 3 shocking objects remained on the floor to awe and baffle the beholder. Near the burned-out fireplace was the great dog, purple decay on the skin left bare by mange and old age, and the whole carcass burst by the puffing effect of rattlesnake poison. It must have been bitten by a veritable legion of the reptiles. To the right of the door was the axe-hacked remnant of what had been a man, clad in a nightshirt, and with the shattered bulk of a lantern clenched in one hand. He was totally free from any sign of snakebite. Near him lay the ensanguined axe, carelessly discarded, and wriggling flat on the floor was a loathsome, vacant-eyed thing that had been a woman, but was now only a mute, mad caricature. All that this thing could do was hiss and hiss and hiss. Both the doctor and I were brushing cold drops from our foreheads by this time. He poured something from a flask on his desk, took a nip, and handed another glass to me. I could only suggest tremulously and stupidly. So, Walker had only fainted that first time? The screams roused him, and the axe did the rest? Yes. Dr. McNeil's voice was low. But he met his death from snakes just the same. It was his fear working in two ways. It made him faint, and it made him fill his wife with the wild stories that caused her to strike out when she thought she saw the snake devil. I thought for a moment. And Audrey, wasn't it queer how the curse of Yig seemed to work itself out on her? I suppose the impression of hissing snakes has been fairly ground into her. Yes, there were lucid spells at first, but they got to be fewer and fewer. Her hair came white at the roots as it grew, and later began to fall out. The skin grew blotchy, and she died. I interrupted with a start. Died? Then what was that thing downstairs? McNeil spoke gravely. That is what was born to her 3/4 of a year afterward. There were 3 more of them. 2 were even worse. But this is the only one that lived. And that is the end of the Curse of Yig. So yeah, this one definitely, it felt a little bit different from a purely Lovecraftian work. But you could definitely see the influence. And you can see that he was co-author, obviously. And that the primary author seemed to, as you had said, work within the sort of the framework of Lovecraft's work and ideas. It seems like an interesting twist. Like most of Lovecraft's work are like foreign. I'm saying like way too much. Good lord. Most of Lovecraft's works are like a foreign threat, something that is outside of common knowledge or awareness. This was like a native threat. You look at the folklore and the Native American idea of Yig as the progenitor serpent god that was before, and the reference for Quetzalcoatl and other similar things. So it's a little bit of a different from the way Lovecraft would also go, but also it had the same roots, the same sort of body horror that we saw in our first story, the same sort of mystery and just coming out of nowhere, and the way it was passed along and discussed as sort of a tale after the fact, with a potentially unreliable narrator. So it definitely feels like Lovecraft, but also its own thing. It was pretty good. I liked it. Let's hide that. But yeah, so it was a nice little change of pace, but also still having that same sort of worry and the anxiety building as you went on. And the horrific accents that I subject everyone else to because I had to sit through it. So, alright, so with 2 stories, we have about hit our time tonight. We had some, it seems, I think the first one, the Horror at Red Hook, was an early example of Lovecraft, and then this was sort of a later release co-authorship of Lovecraft. And like you had said, Lovecraft did encourage other authors to work within his framework, work within his mythos, and sort of expand things through the source of many hands being applied to the work and the expansion of the mythos. So I'm not sure how well it's accepted that Yig is part of the Lovecraftian mythos. I'll have to do some research on my own. But it could fit. It fits pretty well. And it's just odd enough that it could work. It could definitely work. And of course, Lovecraft had to have his little dig in, where trying to flaunt the supremacy of the Aryan society. But at this point, we just take it as we can. Yeah, I'm sure. It's a little bit of struggling at my or a little bit of commiseration together and enjoyment at my suffering of the accents and different languages is understandable. That's why we're here, right? I wouldn't keep doing them if I didn't enjoy it, and you wouldn't be here, right? So, alright, it is pushing 10 o'clock, so let's go ahead and wrap up here for the evening. We got through 2 stories tonight. I'll make sure I mark both of those as done, and then I need to decide, I guess we should actually decide, how much Lovecraft do we want? Do we want to transition from a couple of these short stories and then jump into one of the big ones? Is it time for Call of Cthulhu? Is it time for Mountains of Madness? We'll see. I'll think about that tonight. And if anybody cares to weigh in, I am more than welcome to suggestions, more than open. But these short stories formats are kind of nice. We'll see if we want to continue like this or shift and do one of the core works that really form the center and the centerpiece and the pillar of the Lovecraft mythos. Whether it be Mountains of Madness, which everyone tells me is either the best or the worst, or Call of Cthulhu, which is like, that's exactly what you think of when you think of Lovecraft, right? And there's all the elder gods and things, that the outer beings and the outsiders that you can think of, but you always think of Cthulhu and the great old ones and the deep ones. So maybe it is time for Call of Cthulhu. Maybe. We'll see. I'll make a decision by tonight, by tomorrow. But for now, let's go ahead and call it a night. We will wrap things up, and we will see you guys tomorrow for our next reading, whether it be from another short story of Lovecraft or from one of his primary works. Until then, have a great night, and I hope everyone has dreams that may be less troubled than those that would be inspired by these works. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.